Okay, this is Rob Zako. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to the National Institute for Transportation Communities for making this research possible. Just to be clear, today's presentation isn't a one-man show. In some TV series, the woman does most of the work and the man takes the bows. My fellow principal investigator, Rebecca Lewis, is an assistant professor of planning, public policy and management at the University of Oregon, is the research director for the Sustainable Cities Initiative, where I'm based. I, on the other hand, as Lisa's already said, have no formal training in transportation or planning, but picked up what I know on the streets. Rebecca and I hired a couple hotshot investigators to help us, Alexis Biddle and Roy Isbell, both of whom were pursuing and recently completed dual degrees in law and planning. We asked them to help us follow the money. We are also grateful for the advice of our partners at Transportation for America and the Natural Resources Defense Council. These rocket scientists have been exploring the frontiers of transportation for years, boldly going where no man or woman has gone before. But the ideas presented today and any errors are the responsibility of Rebecca and me. So what is this research about? We looked at two basic things. First, we looked at effectiveness, bang for the buck. How effectively are states and metropolitan planning organizations advancing their own economic development, public health, and other livability goals with investments in transportation? We're also interested in accountability and transparency, that is in process. How are states and MPOs making transportation investment decisions? How could performance-based transportation decision-making processes be improved to provide better outcomes? So we didn't expect this research to be rocket science. We just expected that we would collect information on existing data on performance and analyze the results. In more detail, we considered 10 states and MPOs and studied 6 states and MPOs in details as case studies. We analyzed various documents about transportation investments, and we checked our knowledge with stakeholders from the 6 states and 6 MPOs that we studied. So we didn't have the resources to study all 50 states across the nation. What we did is that we selected 10, a diverse selection to possibly study, and then we end up with 6 in detail. So we looked at California and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission for the San Francisco Bay Area, Massachusetts and the Pioneer Valley MPO for Springfield, Minnesota and the Metropolitan Council for the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities area, Tennessee and the Nashville area MPO, Utah and the Wasatch Front Regional Council for the Salt Lake City area, and finally Virginia and the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization for the Chesapeake area. So what did we find? We talked to our team at the end of this, and our results are going to be published soon in a 150-page report that documents what we learned from all of our case studies. And the results were, well, I'm sorry to say that we failed. We actually weren't able to follow the money. We couldn't tell how effective investments were. And that concludes my talk. I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Actually, just kidding. Okay, to be continued. So, this is actually the beginning of my talk. So I'm going to talk about 4 things today. So I'm going to talk about the problem that we uncovered. We're going to propose some solutions. We're going to compare these to MAP 21 and what is being recommended for performance-based planning and programming. And finally, some conclusions and answer your questions. So let's get started. So Houston, we have a problem. You'll notice I have a few cultural references in this presentation. So think about it. We had this hotshot team, folks with the right stuff. We had 2 PhDs, 2 graduate students, a couple of organizations that have expertise in transportation. We spent a year and we did all we could to just find out what are we getting for our money. And we were unsuccessful. That in and of itself is a key finding, that experts were not able to determine what are we getting for transportation investments. So let me walk you through this. To be clear, we could follow the money up to a point. I mean, we know that nationally, at all levels of government, federal, state, local, we're spending over $300 billion a year on transportation. And we know that that money goes to various modes. 2/3 of it goes to highways, another 1/6 or so goes to transit, and then for other modes. We also know how the money flows between different levels of government. Nationally, roughly half, a bit more than half of money is spent at the local level, but more than half the money comes from federal and state government, and there are transfers between different levels of government to direct which projects are funded. In even more detail, let's take a look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has been doing a lot of things well. In 2009, they created MassDOT, for the first time consolidating all the state transportation responsibilities under one agency. In 2014, they adopted their first multimodal transportation plan. They're renewing their focus on customer service and understanding what the public wants. They're establishing a culture of accountability and transparency, and they've adopted a series of sustainability initiatives collectively known as Green Dot. This figure shows just the flow of state transportation funds. If we were to include federal and local, it'd be a more complicated picture. I won't go into this in detail, but just note there are lots of different pots of money and money being transferred here and there. It's kind of complex. In more detail, we were able to track some of these arrows. Many of these arrows, the flow of money, are set up in statute or in budget bills. So for example, here's something out of Massachusetts laws. Massachusetts has set up the Commonwealth Transportation Fund as a holding account for various transportation revenues. And among those, there's a dedicated sales tax, and statute says $160 million or more should go to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, and another $15 million or more to regional transit authorities. To be clear, we're not questioning the wisdom of Massachusetts making these decisions, but we're trying to follow the money. We're trying to see whether we're getting the outcomes we achieve. And there's nothing here in statute or nothing that we found that indicated what these monies were intended to accomplish. And so we weren't able to determine whether these particular decisions to invest this money is doing what it was expected to do. In even more detail, as you know, states have state transportation investment programs, and metropolitan planning organizations have TIPs. And in great detail, all the projects are funded, at least those that have federal funding or are regionally significant, are listed in these TIPs and MTIPs. So here's a random example from California, another state that's doing things well. And it looks like this project is, look at the project benefits at the bottom. It's promoting safety, economy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, movement of goods. We're sure this is a good project, but we weren't able to track the investments of individual projects or projects in aggregate to overall outcomes and what was the bang for the buck. In brief, it's complicated. Looking not only at STIPs and laws, but long-range transportation plans, budgets, statutes, various reports, we tried to do the best that we could to follow the money and got kind of lost in the plumbing, if you will. So what is this all about? The public doesn't want to get lost in the plumbing. The public just sees that they pay various kinds of taxes, gas taxes, license fees, and so forth. They give it to the government. They know that various things are invested in highways, transit, and so forth. But the question is, what actually does that do? How does it change people's lives? How does it improve businesses? How does it improve the economy? Actually, in even more detail, the public doesn't even care about that much. The public just sees money going in and wonder, what do they get out of it? So I want to define two terms as we move forward. Accountability. Accountability is about results. Accountability is about delivering desired results. Wisconsin DOT says the continuous effort to use public dollars in the most efficient and cost-effective way is what is accountability. Another term is transparency, doing so in an understood manner. If you're transparent, then the public knows what you're doing, how you make decisions, and they trust that you're doing a good job. So in brief, what we found is a lack of transparency. We weren't able to follow the money from money being invested to outcomes that were produced. That's not to say that we don't necessarily have accountability. It may be, it's likely perhaps, that investments aren't being made that actually deliver value, and we have accountability, but we just couldn't see that. So the problem is one of transparency. The problem is reporting to the public, reporting to interested people, what it is we get for the money that we invest in transportation. I don't know if we literally need something like a shareholders report, but something like that that gives the public confidence that the $300+ billion that's being spent annually on transportation is providing things of value to them would be useful. So that's the problem. The problem is one of transparency. The problem is we need to report outcomes to taxpayers. So let's move to solutions. And first, a couple spoilers. First of all, what I'm about to share with you is preliminary recommendations based on our research. We don't pretend to have all the answers, and we'd welcome your feedback and suggestions. Second, this isn't rocket science. What you'll hear is familiar and will sound like common sense. But we've tried to organize a lot of different ideas into a simple, coherent framework, which is what we're offering. And lastly, taken together when we're done, you'll see that what we're proposing is represents a significant reform in how transportation decisions are made in America, something going boldly, if you will, beyond what MAP 21 has already established. So let's get into it. So what we propose is a four-phase approach to transportation decision making. And let's start from the end. Let's start with what we're trying to achieve. We want to know that we're getting outcomes. So at the end of some sort of process, you need some sort of evaluation, some sort of monitoring. You want to report returns on investments to taxpayers. To get there, of course, you have to program. You have to make some investments. And to get there, you need some funding. You can't just invest if you don't have the money. And because transportation planning and decision-making is complex, you need to plan in advance of all the actions you might take which make the most sense. So in a nutshell, this is the framework they're proposing. I'm going to spend some time now walking through this, and then I'll compare and contrast this with MAP 21. But before I do that, let me talk about the benefits of such an approach. We've already talked about transparency and accountability. Transparency again about process, about informing taxpayers and maintaining their confidence, and accountability about delivering value to the public. But taking an outcomes-based approach, focusing on outcomes, there's an opportunity to deliver more bang for the buck, to use limited taxpayer dollars more efficiently and to actually deliver more value to our society. Another important benefit of outcomes-based approach is to resolve conflicts amongst and between transportation and other policies. As we'll see in a moment, it's not necessarily possible to do all things for all people. By focusing on outcomes, it helps to resolve what we can do or what's most important and other things that are optional but maybe not possible. And finally, by being transparent, by reporting to taxpayers what the outcomes are for their taxpayer money, it makes it more possible to maintain and maybe even increase funding for transportation. So the four phases are a cycle: planning, funding, programming, evaluating. To be clear, this is a conceptual framework. These different phases overlap to some extent, and they take place at different times. It's not rocket science. But let me talk for a moment not about rocket science, but about thermodynamics. Bear with me. You'll understand what this analogy is about in a moment. So a physicist has a piston, a container with some air in it. And as you can see, she's slowly expanding the piston. When you expand something, it cools. You've probably experienced this if you have a balloon with air in it and you let the air out quickly, or if you've got a car tire and you let the air out quickly. You feel that the air coming out is cooled. That's called adiabatic expansion. As an aside, for transportation modelers out there, much of transportation mathematics is taken from physicists. What's called the gravity model for distributing trips is based upon something called the Boltzmann factor, Boltzmann equation in thermodynamics. So why do I want to talk about adiabatic expansion in thermodynamics? In physics, physicists are very careful to talk about what's the system. And they talk about isolated systems. So in the case of cooling air, the physicist's goal is to cool the air. That's the goal. To do so, she decides to expand the piston using adiabatic expansion. But to be effective, that's to achieve the outcome that she wants to achieve, is critical for the piston to be well insulated. If the piston had leaks, then expanding the piston would suck in more air, warm air from the outside, and it wouldn't be effective. The concept of an isolated system is crucial. To manage a system, you have to control all parts, not just some of it. So as you've guessed, the analogy with transportation is pretty good, actually. Expanding a piston to cool it is a lot like expanding a highway to reduce congestion. So let's look at this in terms of transportation. So we've got a transportation system. Say it's a highway. It's got a bunch of cars and trucks going up and down it. But it's not an isolated system, obviously. The cars and trucks don't spend their entire time on the highway. They come and go from various places. The point of the highway is to get people from one place to another, from residences, from businesses, from industries, from schools and parks. That's the whole point. So those are also part of the system of interest. And people don't just make choices to travel based upon some law of physics or something like that. They base it based upon what their different options are. What are the different prices or modes? What income level do they have? What are their abilities? What are their demographics? And these things also control the transportation system. And finally, as you know, the transportation system has impacts outside of its narrow realm, has impacts on health, air quality, water quality, communities, and equity. The point is that all these things are part of the transportation system. And if we want to control transportation, that is, if we want to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, we can't limit ourselves to just narrowly what has been called transportation. We have to look at the whole system and the best we can try to understand and affect it. So let's go through the 4 phases. The first phase is planning, and you start with setting real-world goals that matter. So this is pretty basic. Identify the goals by learning what the public wants. Consider the 3 Ps or the 3 Es. In the triple bottom line sustainability, the 3 Ps are prosperity, people, and planet, or if you would, the 3 Es of economy, social equity, and environment. The point here is just that as you're setting goals, don't have narrow goals just focused on one part of the system or one set of users, but to think broadly of all the different stakeholders. Thirdly, as I've said before, it's important to set priorities. We can't necessarily have it all, and some goals conflict with each other. For example, if you've got a state highway that runs through a community and people live and work there and you've got kids, is it more important to have trucks driving quickly, or is it more important to keep people safe? You can't necessarily do both, and that's okay. The point is you need to be clear on what your priorities are and strive for investments that achieve those outcomes. And finally, when you set goals, it's important to quantify performance. Establish objectives, measures, and targets. Tennessee is one of our case study states, and they're doing some good things. In their 25-year long-range transportation plan, they set out 7 guiding principles, like goals. And as you can see here, they're talking about freight, safety and security, people, livable communities, protecting different environmental resources, financial responsibility. This is pretty good and pretty typical. The second step in planning is to determine actions, of course. You start with some broad range of potential actions, and then you pick the ones that affect the goals of interest, and you want to select the ones that are most effective. A good way to do this is to develop different scenarios, different packages of investments, and to test those, and then to choose a scenario that most cost effectively achieves the outcomes you'd like to achieve. Part of this process is modeling the future, of trying to predict the future. Unfortunately, because there are factors that we don't control, models are imperfect and we can't predict the future exactly. Actually, oftentimes we can't predict the future very well at all. That's okay. That's the world we live in. The point is not to strive for perfect predictions. The point is to make decisions in the face of uncertainty and accept that our models are imperfect and make decisions nonetheless. So a good example of this in practice is San Francisco. They recently adopted Plan Bay Area, a scenario plan for both transportation land use. And they have 10 goals and 13 performance measures, and they tested different scenarios, and the preferred scenario achieves some targets, moves in the right direction for other targets, and is moving in the wrong direction for still other targets. Again, it's not always possible to achieve all of your goals. So let's move to the second phase, funding. You can't do anything if you don't have money, obviously. So it's important to secure. Let me try to catch up quickly, skipping over some detail. I'll talk through the steps. It's important to levy taxes to raise needed revenues. You need the revenues, obviously, but you need to be accountable to taxpayers. You need to price efficiently because decisions to tax or impose fees actually affect transportation choices that people make. Massachusetts is doing some great work. their We've Moved Massachusetts Long Range Transportation Plan that they adopted in 2014 really was looking at different scenarios of funding levels, trying to decide what they would get for different funding levels and choosing to make.
Sorry, Rob. One more thing. If you want to put your screen full screen.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And over here.
Great, thank you.
And switch this here. Massachusetts is doing some good things. A really key point is to empower well-positioned decision makers. You want to allocate funding to decision makers that are familiar with the issues on the ground and give them enough flexibility to be able to make the most cost-effective investments. But if you're giving them that flexibility, then you want to hold them accountable to achieving the outcomes they're desired. Virginia's doing a lot of good work. But when they looked at reforming their transportation decision-making process, they were frustrated that various government structures and constraints make it difficult to put the money in the right hands. There's a tension between land use and transportation, where land use decisions that drive the demand for transportation are made by one group of decision makers, but the transportation investments are made by a different group of decision makers, and it's difficult to bring those together. Ideally, you want to have decision makers that are making decisions about the entire system, not just the transportation piece of it. Across the country, we have constitutional statutory constraints on how money can be used. Some states, for example, limit the use of gas taxes to just being spent on roadways. And we don't necessarily question that, but that may prohibit making the most cost-effective investments, if in fact there are other modes that could achieve the outcomes you want to achieve more cost-effectively. Programming, of course, is where the rubber meets the road. It's where we invest in projects. But ideally, if you've done your planning well, then programming is just a exercise in timing. If you've done your planning well, you've already identified the most cost-effective projects and have a package to achieve your outcomes. To do this, you want to be both multimodal and multi-jurisdictional, and it's important to assess not only benefits but also costs. Virginia's doing some great stuff. Their SMART scale is perhaps the best across the country in how to do performance-based programming. They have 6 factor areas and 13 performance measures, and every project gets a scorecard like this that rates the project compared to other projects, and the projects that come out on top are the ones that get funding. Tennessee's also doing some good stuff. They're using a software-driven process developed by DL3, where they look at various factors and weight these, and they use this technical information for staff to invest in the more cost-effective projects. Finally, the last phase is evaluating. You want to measure outcomes on the ground over time, not merely model it before you make an investment, but 1, 5, 10 years afterwards and see whether, in fact, what you thought would happen is happening. It's also important to track cause and effect. An example from the state of Washington is not about transportation so much, but reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see from this graph, total statewide greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Washington declined between the years 2000 and 2002. You might conclude naively that meant, wow, Washington State was doing great stuff. The actions they took to reduce greenhouse gas emissions were having an effect. A couple problems with that. They didn't really start trying to do that until 2007, 2008. First, and secondly, that drop was a result not of anything the state of Washington did, but because the aluminum industry shrunk significantly, reducing the use of electricity, hence production of greenhouse gas emissions. So if you are tracking performance measures and seeing things are moving in the right direction, you shouldn't necessarily conclude that it's because of something you did. It's important to tie targets back to actions and find a cause to determine if there's a cause and effect relationship there. You want to report what you're doing to taxpayers. That's the point of all this. There are different ways to do that, but you want to be accountable. You want to say what outcomes were delivered at what cost. You want to be transparent. You want to report on how decisions were made. You want to be accessible. You want to report succinctly in plain English to the general public. Although this isn't actually a report on outcomes, Utah's Unified Transportation Plan is doing some good things. their Unified Transportation Plan is actually not only for the state, but also for the MPOs. They have a set of goals, key objectives, and performance measures, and their intention is to report statewide at all levels of what progress they're making on these. Minnesota's done some good stuff as well. This is just a one-page summary of where their money comes from and where it goes to, which is a good plain English way to present this. This particular example doesn't talk about outcomes, it's talking about how the money goes to different modes, but it's a step in the right direction. Finally, because things don't always turn out the way we think they will, it's important to analyze outcomes and compare them to what we thought would happen, partly to determine how effective our actions are, but also to assess the accuracy of our models and improve the models going forward. It's also important to compare our targets to progress we make and constantly revise those targets in terms of where we're trying to get. So in brief, this is the framework that we're proposing: planning, funding, programming, evaluating. So none of this is new. MAP 21 is talking about doing some of these things. They have various goals, they have performance measures, and MAP 21 has called for the federal government to establish performance measures and states and MPOs to set targets and report progress on that. Those are steps in the right direction. And subsequent to MAP 21, Federal Highway Administration provided some guidance on performance-based planning and programming. And a lot of good elements are there. They talk about planning, they talk about programming, they talk about evaluation, just as we are. But what's happening at the federal level, MAP 21 is, we would say, necessary but not sufficient. They're doing some things well, but not all that's needed. So in planning, under MAP 21 and under federal legislation, there's a separation between transportation and land use. You have MPOs that have transportation authority that try to address, for example, congestion, and yet they don't make the land use decisions. So you have cities and counties making those decisions separately. They're working cross purposes with each other. We believe that you need to integrate all the factors. You need to look at not just the narrow transportation system, but the larger system. If you want to control that piston, if you want to make sure that you're achieving the outcomes you want to achieve, you need to make sure you don't have too much leakage. Funding is generally not seen as a transportation decision, and yet it has huge impacts, especially in terms of allocating. So if you want to achieve cost-effective investments, then you need to allocate in such a way that decision makers have flexibility and aren't constrained so they can make the most cost-effective investments. Programming, as it's typically done, is not necessarily tightly linked with planning. Plans are over there, and then you do programming. It's almost like the programming is where you're really making the plans. To have a strong outcome-based approach, you want to strongly link planning to programming and have your plans to a great extent have decided in advance which projects you're going to invest in, and it's a question of timing. Finally, in evaluation, we're not seeing a lot of evaluation, frankly, but we're not seeing tracking of cause and effect. You want to integrate planning, programming, evaluating to have a tight loop there. So let me skip over that. Let me put this up and let me turn it to questions now. Okay, let's see here if...
Great, thank you, Rob. Again, apologies to everyone in the audience about the audio mishap. Rob,
so do we have
some
questions?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and start. This one is more of a comment, but also maybe you could elaborate on it or respond to her comment. So you talk about accountability and transparency like they're separate concepts, but I think it's important to acknowledge that transparency is an important factor in accountability. Even if a government is doing what is best for its people, is it really possible to hold the government accountable if the constituents don't have access to details of what the government is doing with their money? Right. Rob, did you hear that question? Let's see. Okay. Again, apologies, everyone. Let me see if I can send this to him.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
So while we're making, we will of course make slides available to everyone, and I apologize for technical difficulties. This one slide, in a nutshell, is what we're proposing, and there's more details in the other slides. I will say now that we're working with Transportation for America to publish shortly a practical toolkit that will be made available to the public, talking about how to make more cost-effective investments in transportation. Okay, I'm seeing a question here about accountability. Part of a question. Do you want to read that, Lisa?
Yeah, sorry. So this question was more of a comment. So the question is, can you talk about accountability and transparency, or you talk about it, those concepts, as separate, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the transparency is an important factor in accountability. Even if a government is doing what's best for its people, is it really possible to hold that government accountable if the constituents don't have the access to details of what the government is doing with their money?
Exactly. The two concepts are linked. The quote from the Sunshine Institute was saying that transparency is necessary for accountability. You want to let people know what the government's doing, and then in a democracy, they can decide whether they're getting the results they want. But if you don't have that transparency, if people don't know what government's happening, then it's really not possible to have accountability. Our emphasis on going all the way to the end to the reporting, to having a feedback that not only do you invest in things that may be good, may deliver results, but report those to the public and to say how much it cost, what bang for the buck that you get, is the way you get that transparency that leads to accountability.
Okay, great. And another question from the audience, do you have any examples of specific projects that show MPOs tracking their investments and linking to outcomes?
We haven't found any good examples of that happening after the fact. What we're finding is a lot of good work at the programming, in the programming phase, before you make an investment, you decide what investments to make, and modeling what those outcomes are. We're seeing good work with planning, or starting to see good work integrating performance-based approaches into planning, but we haven't seen examples after the fact of tracking things on the ground.
Okay, and which of these 4 steps is most absent from transportation now?
Well, as the guidebook for Federal Highway Administration talking about performance-based planning and programming, we're seeing a lot of work at those levels. The two that are missing are funding and evaluating. Funding, of course, is happening. I think that there could be some more accountability and transparency with the funding. The real weakness is in evaluation. The previous question is that investments are made, $320 billion annually across the United States. We know that we're building highways, bridges, tunnels, providing transit service rails, but we're not tracking what outcomes we get for that. And so without the evaluation, it's really hard to know, are we getting bang for the buck? Are we getting value?
Mm-hmm. All right. And what evidence is there that MPOs and local governments that regulate land use are working on cross purposes with each other?
Well, what evidence is there? I think it's a matter of control, and that MPOs under federal law make transportation decisions. Cities and counties make land use decisions. And what we see is that sometimes some of the same decision makers wear both hats, but when they're wearing the transportation hat, they say, we have to build more highways, we have to provide more transit service because there's going to be more people, and it just is. And then they switch hats and make their land use decisions and are not thinking about the transportation implications. Those decisions happen in different forums, and so what we see in some cases is that in many cases there's not a linkage between transportation and land use. To make it more positive, the example from California with scenario planning is they're explicitly trying to combine those decisions by having an integrated land use and transportation scenario, what they call blueprint planning, so that you have both aspects on the table and you're looking at it in front of whatever decision makers are involved.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. All right, so back to when you were speaking about mobility and safety. Is a government body, a city, for example, justified in giving the public what they need and not what they want? Often, I find speed and safety as contradictory, slower speed limits in roundabouts, for example.
In this research, we've tried not to make value decisions. Our question is whether transportation investments are achieving the goals that policymakers have set. And I guess you're asking what those goals should be. And although I have personal opinions, I would say that that's up to policymakers to decide what the priorities are and how they interact with the public. And maybe the public wants to go fast, and policymakers say safety is more important, and therefore they're going to lower speed limits to have greater safety. I think that if that's a decision that's made and that's reported to the public, both what the decision is, what outcomes that achieves, and how they arrived at that decision, that will help provide trust and understanding from the public. And I think that that's what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. All right, Rob. And I guess a final question here is, with your work with these agencies, is there any continued work to implement your conclusions and your recommendations?
Well, we're coming to the end of this particular research project of what we're doing. We started out asking one question that we thought we could survey what investments are made and basically rate them. This turned into a different kind of research project. We've ended up coming up with this framework. This is preliminary and begs a lot of questions that we would be interested in pursuing with additional resources. But what I would say is that states and MPOs, the case studies we looked at and others, are the laboratories of democracy. What MAP 21 has done is that it's focused the attention on performance-based outcomes, and various jurisdictions are taking that to heart and going above and beyond MAP 21. And I think we're going to be seeing in coming years some really innovative ideas and some mistakes as people try to do this, and then we'll learn together from those successes and mistakes.
All right, great. Thank you again, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us on our webinar. All right, and let's see here. All right, and we will be sharing the presentation and slides and the link to the video in our post-webinar. You can also view other professional development offerings on our website at nitc.track.pdx.edu. All right, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.